Good evening and welcome to UQ, everyone. My name is Andrew Garnett. I'm also from the Energy Initiative, but also the Director for the Centre for Coal Seam Gas here at UQ. And my job tonight is simply to read out these words that someone else gave me. There is a couple of tough ones on here, so when I stumble a bit, just be patient. But I'm really here to introduce our distinguished speakers. So welcome, everyone. I will say a little bit at the beginning, there's actually no firearms or anything prepped tonight, so if it goes off, it's the real thing, and the exits are up the top there, and there's an exit around the side here. But the primary exit for you people will be up the top. Again, no alarm, so if it goes off, it's the real McCoy. So tonight we've got 3 speakers. Each speaker is going to give us a 15-minute presentation on energy in India. I'll tell you a little bit about it in a moment. Each 15 minutes is one after the other, and the questions we'll save to the end, if that's okay with everyone. We've got then a panel session at the end, which will go for nominally what will be, I don't know, 25 minutes, depending on how much liveliness there is. I will remind you, though, the longer the questions go, the longer you wait for the drinks at the end. So and I'll remind you that every 5 minutes throughout the questions, just in case you've got them. So our first speaker is going to be Professor Gautam Yadama, who's here with us as a guest from Brown School at Washington University, St. Louis. He's a researcher in India on understanding the livelihoods of natural resource-dependent poor and looking at strategies for sustainability in their lives and resources. He's a recent book called Fires, Fuels and the Fate of 3 Billion. It's a state of energy impoverished, which examines the complex relationship between cook stoves and health in the developed world. So Gautam's going to be first. He's going to then be followed by Alexie. Alexie is here as our guest also. She's the director and national manager of Pollinate Energy. Pollinate Energy is a not-for-profit organization and social enterprise that aims to eradicate energy poverty by providing the urban poor communities in India, with sustainable energy solutions and through a microloan system. So it's quite an innovative and quite a different slant to Gautam's. She supports the organisation, the Pollinate organisation, in business development, in fundraising and expansion strategy, and I understand she's about to move to India next year. And our final speaker then will be Greig, who most of you will know. He's the director of the Energy Initiative here. He is also heading up the Energy Poverty Research Group, and I won't go into his background because I think we've done it at every single Energy Initiative one we've got so far. So what we've got is each speaker is going to come up 15 minutes, a slightly different perspective. We'll let them run one after the other, and after that questions and answers. So without further ado, I'll ask Gautam to come up and kick off with our Power Matters. Thank you.
You can hear me? Yeah? Is that loud? Good. A little higher? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me this evening, and I've spent a wonderful week here at the university, and I always enjoy coming here, and I look forward to doing that more in the future. This is to you, Chris. Well, you know, in July 2012, I think this session is called Power and India, or Power in India. So I kind of wanted to talk about power matters, but I'll really quickly go to energy and energy poverty. But in July 2012, in India there was a massive power outage, and I think many of you probably at least remember that. It made news in the world over. And about 550 million people were out of power. But what about the other 450 million? You know, it didn't really matter when that huge power outage took place, because on a daily basis, maybe 450 to 500 million people in India have very marginal access, if not any. So that's really the context for anything we might discuss and do, both in our universities or also on the ground, like what Pollinate does, and what our students and researchers might think about researching as they go forward. That is, how do you ensure that those who are absolutely lacking in productive power, very energy insecure. How do you bring them out of this mess? And what are the complexities involved? So beyond numbers, I'm not going to talk a lot about numbers. I'm really going to try and give you a flavor of the problem. So I will shamelessly promote my book, because I talk about this in a book that's called Fires, Fuel, and the Fate of 3 Billion. So it's really, the talk is taken from there. Now, why have we failed to address this problem today, that we still have roughly 3 billion people in the midst of us using primitive stoves and primitive lighting systems, kerosene lamps, rely on wood, agricultural waste, as well as charcoal to power their needs? And what is this problem of energy poverty? And why does it keep, persisting, and how do we understand it? And that's really what I think we have to think about very deeply. Instead of giving stock solutions and answers, really reflect, take some time, pause, and think about this seriously. But it all starts with the hunt for fuel, because those who don't have daily sources of energy, how do they get it? Perhaps you should get a sense of what I'm talking about. And this is something from a field site where I actually do some work. Let's see, I'm going to get this right. That's a woman hacking away in the middle of a forest, and you hear all the crickets, and this is actual sound in that same forest. And you hear women talking in the back. So that's at the edge of Satkosia forest in Orissa in southeastern India, where one very early morning, a few years ago, I'd gone into the forest with the women, and that's a daily hunt for fuel, how it sounds and looks and feels. And these are, let's not feel sorry for this population, because make no mistake that these women are strong, they're very proud, they're just doing what is needed to be done to secure daily sources of energy for their homes. But it's a complex story. It's a complex story of poverty, culture, ecosystems, affordable technologies, environment, health, gender inequalities, that all have to be unpacked if we're really going to get to the bottom of how to address it in a sustained way. And every part of this process, from the hunt for the fuel to the daily burning, has enormous, staggering consequences in terms of health and for the ecosystems that I just mentioned. Now you see here, this is from another part of India. Just like what you see here, women come tumbling down out of forests carrying wood. Sometimes carrying wood while also caring for children, like you see here. What you see here is not just the weight of that wood the woman is carrying with the baby in the front, but what you don't see, but you sense probably, is the weight of social norms that women must bear. And again, this is implicated in addressing energy poverty. We have to understand that. And then when these women get home, they only come home to, and the quality of their life is determined by how the chores that they have to do, the norms within the household. For instance, cooking. Why we all know this? Women cook with wood. But in the process, they're compromising not only their health, but also that of children well before they're born. So here's a woman who is 7 months pregnant, cooking probably 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. And some of this fine particulate matter that they're taking in on a daily basis essentially will cross the blood organ barrier and will have significant implications for children when they're born, or infants. And so how do you think of a case of a pregnant young bride like this who is enmeshed in this problem, and how do you get behavior change? Who do you need to address? Who do you need to talk to? This is another aspect of this very complex problem. Now what's interesting about this is all of this complexity is in small daily acts, and this is partly a feature of a complex system. That is, complex emergent systems, adaptive systems, small things accumulate on a daily basis and produce effects and thresholds that you cannot recover from, whether it's in the ecosystem or whether it's population health at a certain level because of this problem, whether it is whatever you want to think about it in this space. And I'd like to underscore that it's in the everyday acts where women are collecting wood and bringing it home and then meeting energy needs of homes that are energy insecure that you get these complexities embedded. Now, part of it, the backdrop for this is the choices that these women are making on a daily basis to support the lives and livelihoods of their families. But these choices are essentially, they're fragile and they're quilted in nature. That means they have maybe 2 or 3 different strategies of livelihood that they're knitting together. If something fails, they go to the other. And just think of it, and I'm not going to go deeply into this. We talk about climate change and environmental risk and so on. But all those are experienced at one level. That is, populations like this experience them very directly in tangible ways. So if crops fail one day, or invasive species are taking over the grasslands that like a tribe like this woman belongs to, where they actually graze buffalo for milk, and they can't do that anymore because of invasive species are taking over the grasslands. What do they go to? They go to making charcoal to supply in peri-urban, urban slums where, again, you have massive numbers of energy poor. You see, again, those interconnections and feedback systems from afar affecting local fragile lives. And so these ripple effects are something that I want to draw your attention to. You'll also see, I just put this picture up just to show you that in the dry lands of India and in sub-Saharan Africa, where you see this population and this problem the most, people are barely, eking out a living. And then, so they have to depend on these neighboring hills for all kinds of things. That also affects, in the long run, how you get them out of this energy mess. Now let me, I want to show you something again, one more slide. So here's a farmer extracting groundwater in Orissa. But all these complex systems that I've been talking about, the different aspects and elements of it, I want to give you one more slide with a good sense from the field how farmers talk about it. And the translation comes up.
అదే భూమి ఎప్పుడైతే బోర్లు వేసినామో మనకు ఉన్నోడు ధనికుడు అయిపోయా. ఉన్నోడు బోర్ వేసుకునే వాడేమో 4 ఎకరాలు 10 ఎకరాలు పంట పెట్టుకుంటాడు. పక్కన 10 మంది వెళ్ళిపోయారు వాని గురించి. నా ఒక్కని గురించి ఈ బాయ్కి సార్ ఇదంతా మళ్ళీ బస్తాలు ఒడ్లు అయ్యేది. బావి ఉంది, బావి ఉండదు సార్, పెద్ద బావి ఉంది. దానికి ఈ సైడ్ బోర్ వేసారు. ఏడొకటి ఇప్పుడు ఈడ 150 బస్తాలు ఒడ్లు అయ్యేది. ఒక్క పావు కాలే, కనీసం ఓ బస్తా పంట పెట్టుకునే దానికి నీళ్ళు ఉండవు. ఇప్పుడు ఆ బోర్ లేకపోతే ఆడ బావిలో నీళ్ళు ఉండేవి. ఆ బావికి ఆపోజిట్ ఏడవ బోర్ ఉంది. దానికి మనకి ఎదురుగా ఏడొకటి ఉంది. ఆ చింత చెట్టుకి ఆ పక్క ఒకటి ఉంది. ఇప్పుడు మనకి ఎదురుగా దాడ ఆడవ బోర్ ఉంది. దానికి ఆపోజిట్ ఆడవ బోర్ ఉంది. ఆ బావిలో నీళ్ళు ఎక్కడి నుండి వస్తాయి? ఇంకా ఆ బోర్లో వదలేకొద్దికి తగ్గిపోతాడు. అప్పుడు మనం ఈ రైతు ఎట్లా పంట పెట్టగలుగుతాడో ఇక్కడ అట్లా రైతులు చాలా అంగళాలకు పోవడము. ఇప్పుడు మీరు బియ్యాలు కొనుక్కుంటే ఆయన భూమి మీద ఆయన పెట్టుకున్నాడు. మనకి నీళ్ళు ఇస్తారా?
ఎవరు మాట్లాడలేదు
ఇప్పుడు బోర్ వేసేది
చేసుకుంటే బాగుంటుంది కదా.
మంచి చేసుకునే దానికి లేదు సార్ ఇప్పుడు నాకున్నదిరా నేను వేసుకున్నా నువ్వు వేసుకోపో
నువ్వు వేసుకుంటే నేను వద్దన్నా
నువ్వు వేసుకుని నేను వద్దన్నానా అది అది
అన్యోన్యత అనేది
వేసుకున్నాడు అనుకో వాని కర్మ చాలక బోర్లో నీళ్లు పడకపోయానుకో ఆత్మహత్య చాలా జనం తెచ్చినారు సార్ అట్లా అప్పులు ఎక్కువగా బోర్ వేయాలంటే 2 లక్షలు కాదు
మోటార్ కంటే
దాని నోట్లో మాట ఉండేవాళ్ళు అప్పు ఎత్తుకొచ్చి వేసినాడు అనుకో ఇది ఫెయిల్ అయింది అనుకో ఈడు ఫెయిలే.
So that gives you a very good sense of these complexities I'm talking about. That is how farmers are thinking about their very fragile agricultural systems, and then they're competing against each other, not cooperating, while natural resources such as aquifers are depleting. And in this context, you go in with energy systems and asking them to actually shift and make these transitions and leapfrog to renewables. How do you sustain it? That's the challenge. And that's why you get ecosystems like this and then degrading livelihoods. So my essential point here is that this is a very complex problem, and we have to be engaging with this complex problem in all of its, complexity. And as you can see in all of this, there's an entire cycle of things that are interrelated on energy, environment, and air, food and water, health, sustainable livelihoods. That's the coupled nature of this problem. And in that interview that I was doing, that's not the same farmer, because I couldn't show you that same farm. It's somewhere else that I'd done that. I just put up a portrait of a farmer. So this is what we need to think about, and this is what, in fact, Washington University, University of Queensland, and others were joined to do some of this work. And it's not going to be an easy path. There are going to be a lot of places where it will be stuck. Our innovations will be dead in the water, just like this, but we'll have to forge ahead. And then we can talk more in the Q&A. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. And while I invite Alexie to come up now, can I say something I forgot at the beginning? Please, can you just turn your phones onto silent while we're in the hall here? Thank you very much again, Gautam. Alexie's now going to talk about the work done by her organisation and the sustainable solutions she's trying to bring to the urban poor in India. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. That was a really great introduction, Gautam, and very poignant for us, because that July 2012 moment was actually the catalyst that sparked the founding of Pollinate Energy, because we had the same perspective. 500 million people didn't have energy. That actually happens every day in India, and something that largely was going unrecognized. And we'd actually, as a team, spent time with those people just before that blackout happened, and that's what inspired us to get going. So Gautam's given us a really great overview of I guess, the context of energy poverty challenges across the world, in particularly India. I wanted to start tonight by bringing you back down to talk about one of the people that really inspired me to go on this journey with Pollinate Energy. I met her a few years ago in Bangalore. I was walking down a busy street and came across a slum community that was near the place that we were staying. And this woman, Lakshmi, came forward to speak to me. Lakshmi's story is so typical of the many people we serve across India. She grew up in a rural village, probably not unlike the ones that Gautam's working with now. Her family were very poor. At the age of 12, they decided they couldn't afford to keep her any longer, so she was married to a man in the local village. And at 12, her and her new husband made the long journey to Bangalore in search of a brighter future. When I met Lakshmi, she was 26 years old, which happened to be the same age that I was at the time. And it was no longer just her and her husband, but also their 4 small children, living in a tent, no more than a blue plastic tarpaulin sheet stretched over a bamboo frame, and with nothing but a kerosene lamp to light up their home. And that kerosene, this guy doesn't click, but that doesn't matter. That kerosene was so interesting to us because it was really expensive. Lakshmi's spending $3 to $5 every week just for enough kerosene to provide a flame so that she can have light in her home. It's slowly killing her and her children. They're inhaling the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarette smoke every day from the indoor air pollution from cooking and light in their home. It's harmful for the environment. I think we all know what the impact is there. But most importantly for Lakshmi, and what I could see as I sat there with her and the sun began to set, is that she is living her life in the darkness. And when it's dark, you can't cook or clean, so you give up your working hours to do that for your family. When it's dark, you can't see your children when they come home each evening. You'll never see the face of your husband. And the kids that you're so desperately trying to give an education to have no opportunity to study or learn or stay ahead at school. Now, we were there with Lakshmi to try and figure out a way to change that kerosene lamp and swap it into a solar-powered lantern, which might sound really easy, except when you think of the context of India, which is that there are about 400 million people who still don't have access to electricity. So whatever we did had to be something that could scale and that could be replicated and shared, which is why we founded Pollinate. So basically what we do at Pollinate is we find local people who live in the city, people who are inspired and motivated to work with the families that live in slums. And we train them up and give them their own micro-business to run with us, selling solar-powered lanterns into slum communities. We call them our pollinators. They go out every day with a backpack of solar lights and walk into communities, go tent to tent, helping families understand what a solar light is, how it's going to help them, and then helping them buy one on an affordable payment plan, something even Lakshmi could afford. She was one of our first customers in Bangalore. Within 5 weeks, she'd paid off her light. Within a few months, she's broken even on that investment, and now she's saving $100 every year, which is 5% of her income. Now, we have very much taken a grassroots approach to this problem. We spent time on the ground, in the communities, understanding not only what they needed, but also what they wanted. Because it's not unless they wanted are they going to actually pay for this product. And that was very important to us. Imagine if you guys want to buy a new phone. The first step you might take would be to talk to a friend about the model that they have. You might go online and check out some product reviews. Then you might go into a shop with all the information that you have and talk to a sales assistant to try and determine which phone is best for you. If you can't afford the phone, that's okay, because most companies will give you a 2-year payment plan linked to your direct debit on your bank account, which you all have because Dolomites did an awesome campaign when you were young. And you can pay that phone off over 2 years. Almost no questions asked. Now think of Lakshmi. She doesn't have access to the internet, so she can't do product reviews. Everyone else in her community is using kerosene, so that's what she chose to use. She doesn't have a bank account. She doesn't have a fixed address. Nobody would loan her money to improve her situation. But she has no spare money because she's spending it all on kerosene every week, which is why our model is helping these people lift themselves out of that situation. But we're definitely not the only player in this game, and that's why it's so great to be here this evening alongside Gautam and Chris, who are parts of the puzzle as well. Because, quite frankly, 400 million people in India without electricity, not even in our wildest dreams of ambitions that we have to scale our model across India, could we possibly reach every single person that needs us. It would take us decades, and we want it to happen faster. So there's a few other things that we're doing as an organisation to make sure it does happen faster. The first is learning. We're not the only people in the world providing solar lanterns to these communities. There are many examples of success around the globe, and we partner with them. Organisations like SolarAid in Africa, who've sold 1 million lights, and we've sold 10,000. They're an excellent partner for us to help us scale. The second is adapting and being fearless about change. Because even though this solar light is a really good product that lots of people can use in communities around India, already by moving from Bangalore to Hyderabad to Kolkata, we're seeing huge amounts of on-the-ground variation that we need to respond to quickly to make sure our model actually works. And the third one is sharing. And this is the interesting line we tread as a not-for-profit social enterprise. It's not in our interest to develop a business that we are going to be really successful at and scale and take over the world purely for the sake of developing a business that does that. What we are interested in is impacting people who need access to energy. A couple of months ago, we had a really big, great piece of news on ABC's Foreign Correspondent, which exposed us to over 500,000 Australians in 2 days. Also to many millions of people around the world. What I didn't expect from that was to receive phone calls from Ethiopia, Mozambique, Philippines, Mexico, Cambodia, other parts of India, who all wanted us to take their model to them. We can't do that. Definitely not right now. But I'm sure there's something we can do. So by sharing our knowledge and helping those people get their own opportunity off the ground and take their own initiative because they're the ones with the local knowledge who can make it happen for them, hopefully we can have an impact much greater than what we were originally planning to do with Pollinate. So I hope that gives you a bit of context about where we're sitting right now. And I'll leave it to the Q&A and Chris to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And finally, we've just heard a couple of stories at the human scale, talking about complexity, talking about real people and families. And scale, I think, is a large thing that Chris is now going to touch upon. So we're talking about this massive country, India, and Chris is going to talk a bit there about the scale. Thanks, Chris.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, so when I think about energy in India, it's pretty much as everyone who's heard me before, when I think about energy generally, I quickly come back to the question of scale and how do we deliver the level of need that people ultimately want. And so the work that is being done to give basic access to people is critical. But what's next? And that's really what I'm going to talk about. The scale of growth that needs to happen in India is phenomenal, but it needs to go in transitions. So the first is basic access. How do we give people clean cooking fuel to resolve the health challenges, to resolve the livelihood challenges? And how do we give people lighting to resolve the same challenges? That has to be done. But the next phase is they want affordable, reliable, secure energy. They want it for production and productive enterprises. And what comes after that, pretty much only after real prosperity is achieved, is adding the sustainability into the mix. That tends to be the way people behave, whether or not it's what we would like to believe. So we've got to manage the transition from access to reliable, affordable supply, and then we've got to make it sustainable, and hopefully we can do those together. Why is that electricity access important? So this is a graph of Human Development Index. It's a mix of various parameters that basically go towards how well off and how our livelihoods are as humans. And on the x-axis, so that's the y-axis, the x-axis is electricity use per capita. So you see Democratic Republic of the Congo at the very low end, and you see United States, Finland at the top end, and you see Australia, 10,000, this is us, 10,500 kilowatt hours per person per year. You see India, 750 kilowatt hours per person per year, and you get to the Congo and places like that where we get down to the 50 type level. So putting those into context, we talk about averages, but averages actually are a bit meaningless. So if I say India is 750 kilowatt hours per person per year, and we're 10,500, you immediately think, well, that's less than a tenth of us, that's nothing. But then there's 400 million or 500 million. The numbers are rubbery, to say the least. that lack what they call access. But access has got a specific definition in these discussions. Access means 50 kilowatt hours per person per year if you live in a rural community, or 100 kilowatt hours per person per year if you live in an urban area. What does that mean? It gives you one or more of these. One light bulb for 5 hours a day, one fan for 5 hours a day, and one mobile phone charging for 5 hours a day. So the 100 might give you 2. The 50 might give you 1. Depending on what sort of device you use, you might get a bit of a mix. But that's it. So what about that? What about the transition from basic, low-level, clean, dirty cooking to LPG and or some other form of cooking, to what we expect, to the sorts of appliance that these households might have in some years to come? Well, that's more than 1,000 kilowatt hours per year. So that's more than the average of India now, and there's 400 million people who are less than a tenth of that. So if you're like me, who likes to cook, I'm 2,000 kilowatt hours a year through my stove. So there's a transition here which is tremendously challenging. Now, what that's really saying to us is India's got a long way to go. But don't forget, India's already a major energy economy. So we look at those stats, we look at the images we've had to see, and we see a nation starving of energy. But this is what it looks like. It's the world's 4th biggest user of primary energy. And in the last 30 years, primary energy went up 400%. Electricity went up 500%, more than 500%. It's the 3rd biggest coal consumer, the 4th biggest oil, the 5th biggest wind, the 6th biggest hydro, and I can go on. So it is a massive energy economy. And what this graph shows us is the dominant role coal is playing. So roughly 68% of the electricity production in India today is coal, hydro's 13, natural gas 10, and the rest make up relatively small proportions. But the next 30 years is going to be interesting as well, because the growth is predicted to be larger. So, what's needed and what we expect to happen is that energy for productivity and mobility is going to come. Not for those going through the access phase yet, but if we look on a multi-decade point of view, we are going to see a much, much bigger transition. So we expect electricity consumption to grow another 400% in that time. And we expect, and it's very difficult for us to imagine how we'll do that without large-scale generation, at least in some parts of India. That's going to take many forms. It will include coal, it will include gas, it will include nuclear, and it will include renewables. There is no escaping this fact that to achieve the level of scale that we're talking about, it is going to require all forms of energy. What is critical, though, that in those transitions, we use the most efficient, least polluting options in every case. So whether it's coal or whether it's renewables, we are going to use some of both, and we have to use the best options we have available. So the discussions that go on around Australian coal going to India, for example, there are some benefits to that. The coal they use in India is far more polluting. One of the stats that worries me greatly is that there are 185 coal-fired power stations under construction in India today. But they are all low efficiency, highly carbon intensive. It would take a very small change in policy for those to go to high efficiency, lower emissions plants. Now this is not about wanting to do things with coal, this is about what's actually happening. And so we've got to find a way where we make that happen in the most efficient, clean way we can. And thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris. I'll ask the 3 speakers to come up and sit at the panel. And while they're doing that, could you please just talk amongst yourselves? Just get your questions ready. And we have someone going around with a microphone, I understand. Christine around?
Yeah,
Christine, where are you? Yep. Stand up. Okay.
It's just us three.
So we've got two people with microphones here. So it sounds like it's a well-ordered, a well-sounded room, but actually you do need the microphones. We've had this trouble before in the past. So if you could raise your hand if you have a question, and just wait until the microphone reaches you. Thank you very much. So, anybody who wants to start off? We've got the gentleman over here. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Syed, and my question is from Gautam. First of all, thank you for the excellent presentation. And my question is basically, as you mentioned, that it's all complex systems, as we can see. And what I've observed in my experience throughout my life in Pakistan, which is a bit similar to India in these cases, is that there's a very obvious class difference between the people who actually are making the policies and the people that we are discussing over here. How do you bring those people who are making the policies and who actually influence the change to actually, how do you bring them down to care for the actual person who is suffering from the energy crisis? That's it.
I suppose that's a question in most development policy, right? How do you bring the policymaker to be more empathetic to those who are embedded in these social dilemmas, energy dilemmas on a daily basis? But with regard particularly to the energy sector, I think Chris's presentation after what we just both spoke really highlights something very interesting, which is the inequalities. Because you have an economy in the aggregate which is an energy, bursting with growth in energy, but you still have people like the ones I'm talking about and Alexie's talking about. So then the question is for the policymaker is how do you take the fruits of economic growth and enable them, or distribute them widely? So then the policy design, it's not so much that the policymakers are unaware, it's the policy design. And the policy design, in large part, is an outcome of political advocacy and policy advocacy. And that is something on India's side. Let me just, when you compare countries, and I'm not going to mention other countries, but I think this is something that is really favorable for India, because there are lots of very good actors engaged in pushing the government and policymakers to think more carefully about the marginal populations so it's a good point you're raising. And I think this is where the political economy matters also in all of this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you have someone else? Up the top there, gentleman in shirt, white shirt.
Yes, this might be for Chris, but I was just wondering if you could give us some figures on the number of deaths due to the pollution from cooking in India as well as perhaps China?
Certainly, the number in India, the number globally is something like 4 million a year. I think India is probably a half of that number.
India is about India is actually very high, about 1 million. About a
so
million.
A quarter of the global total.
Mm-hmm.
I believe China is in that same order, and then throughout the sub-Saharan Africa is very significant as well. So think about it as 4 million a year globally, and then think about spread amongst the various energy impoverished regions.
And mostly children under 5
Yeah.
or elderly. It's sort of like the two ends of the scale where the deaths occur.
Thanks. Jim Underschultz from UQ. It seems to me that the approach one might take in rural areas compared to urban areas could be substantially different. I haven't heard anybody talk about that. Have you got ideas on that in terms of providing energy in an effective way?
Yeah, so definitely. We specialise in the urban areas, and we chose to do that because nobody else was in that space. So it was somewhere where we knew we could get in and make quite a big impact quite quickly. There's lots of differences. The main ones that we see is that people who live in urban poverty, so slum, shantytown style dwellings that we deal with, they look transient and non-permanent, which has meant that historically there's been a very low level of trust dealing with those communities, both ways, because they've been mistrusted by NGOs and then they sort of don't trust people who come in to help them. So the biggest challenge for us was to be able to get in there and provide a loan to someone like Lakshmi, where no one else would have dared to do that before, and we took that risk ourselves. So that's the first one, that there's been no microfinance action or loan action in those communities. And the second is that, like Lakshmi, everyone comes from somewhere else, and India is a beautiful country with diverse, religion, language, culture, which means you walk into a community and there might be 4 or 5 languages spoken across that community, and often neighbours can't speak to one another, which creates a really different environment to walk into and try and change or make change in, compared to a rural village where there's maybe like long histories of family connections and relationships and a more collective knowledge, if you will. So we have to come up with ways to understand who each player is, be able to trust them. You know, there's not much social collateral in those communities. Like, we can't necessarily verify one person to the next because they can't speak to each other themselves. So yeah, it's much more fragmented in the urban space. And that's why we sell products that are single household, packaged, can take in a backpack style products, whereas in an urban, rural environment, you might be able to do something more like a community scale intervention, which would, I think, always be favourable because it's much longer lasting. But those are the 2 sort of main areas that we see. I don't know if you've seen others.
Well, I touched on, when I was talking about the complexity, a lot of that really understanding comes from rural agrarian communities, which is what Indian rural communities are. While I agree with you that you can actually probably do collective action much better with rural communities, but rural communities, these urban populations like Lakshmi, they're coming from rural areas. Now why? That's because they're unable to actually eke out a living. With the perturbations and the spectrum of perturbations on livelihoods in rural areas are just increasingly getting, very difficult to understand. They're not only just, let's forget climate change and all this and crop failures and drought. Policy perturbations, this is what's so interesting that we have to think about. We're all very privileged in this hall. When we make policies, and I want to come back to this point, we think of policies, we think of interventions, but sometimes we think of them in very static ways. And what happens when you actually introduce policies in rural areas, and I'll give you a very quick example. In the state of Karnataka, there was a policy where it said, the state will subsidize if you want to dig for groundwater. It's great, because a policymaker or a politician who's pushing that wins the election because farmers love it, and the rich farmers capture that subsidy, start digging. And then what happens soon, as you saw in that interview, you get a whole bunch of others impoverished, and then people start migrating. So this is the complexity of actually interventions in rural areas. And they're not far-fetched. Some of these drivers are very proximate, but there are accumulated effects in that complex emergent system that one has to think about, and that's really the challenge in the rural areas. And Chris and I talk about this all the time, but it's great that others are...
Yeah. If I add to that comment in terms of the future larger scale, more productive capacity that might be required, I do think there's a substantial difference. So people who are in the grid or at the fringe of grid are probably, it's a lot easier for them to rely on large-scale centralised generation with grid extensions and the like. But further removed from the grid, this is where large-scale renewables with microgrids and that could well play a significant role. And certainly in an interim transition, I think almost certainly will have to, because there's a whole bunch of governance challenges about extending large transmission and distribution infrastructure to in India.
And we'll have to experiment with these things, and I think we're thinking about those.
But I think, Gautam, you just explained the phenomenon that's happening is actually a centralisation of power and capital with subsidy flowing to where the capital is. So the energy will go the same way. There will be someone who has a pump system, and there'll be somebody who has a refrigeration system. So the whole network will start to change from very small players to very big centralized nodes in the economic system, and therefore in the energy system. And again, that's a different driver of energy, very much different than in your environment there. Interesting. Up the top there. Is there another one? Here too? Yeah, this one first, and then at the top afterwards. Thanks.
Hi. I was just got a question for Chris. You mentioned that there's 185 new coal-fired power plants in development in India at the moment. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the opportunities and challenges for making that infrastructure change from what's currently being developed into newer technology or into different forms of energy production.
Look, I think that's a case of the horses bolted. I think those, a lot of those plants are under construction. The prospects for changing the technology are very, very limited. But the number of coal-fired power plants in India that are under planning is much more than that. And so where I think we could do some real change is to actually influence the technology basis for them. Some of those are supercritical plants, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them are still subcritical plants. So, you know, there's a 20 or 30% emissions reduction gain there just in building the right technology. There's also the question about what the coal resource, what's the best coal resource to use in them to limit emissions as well. So there are some opportunities there, and it's not just with the 185. That's just to illustrate we're already on this track.
So that's a locked-in, effectively a locked-in emission, locked-in fuel, locked-in technology. So what's the policy driver that's driving? Is it simply a price driver?
Look, I've asked that question because I was stunned to hear we were building that many subcritical plants, and these are very serious investors. You know, the Tata Powers, the ILFS, and the answer was the technology availability in India isn't really there. And interestingly, the supercritical plants that are coming seem to be driven by foreign-financed Chinese and Japanese technology. So there is now a willingness for India to allow those higher technologies and foreign investors to come in, and that hopefully will drive a bit of a transition to a better quality of technology.
And access to capital, or just access to the raw technology?
Both, yeah.
I think it's also worth mentioning there that like India is, while they're building 185 coal plants, which is devastating, they're also building a lot of wind
and solar.
And solar.
Yeah.
And so it just comes back to the enormity of the problem. And I think India's built more wind. One company has built more wind in the last year than we've done in Australia in the last decade. So it's just huge. And there's definitely, and that's from foreign finance companies as well. So obviously there's some drivers there to innovate, but there's just a really big problem.
It's quite a remarkable policy. So they have a policy to build 100 gigawatts of solar, including fairly large-scale solar, and 60 gigawatts of wind between now and 2025, and they'll do it. But they're also building 1,500 or 2,000 gigawatts of coal. So, and that's not as good a technology. That's not the latest technology. So, but what they're doing with solar and wind is fantastic. But it's not enough.
Yep.
Hi. I just had a question about access to capital. You know, the IFC and the US are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in partnerships and investment in renewable energy and other kinds of energy sources in India. And I wondered about the political environment. So if you had to give Modi a grade on what he's said and what he's been able to do, how would you rate his time in term so far, and are you optimistic about the future?
Who's going to take that one?
You're asking me?
Yeah. A grade out of 10, I think it was. It's some marking papers again.
You know, this is the peril and the beauty of a democracy, right? It's 3 steps forward, maybe 4 steps backward, and then you'll leapfrog eventually when everybody's on board. So I think just one person is not going to get this done. But it is important that you have leaders that will shape the mood in the country about this is doable, we can do it. So on that count, I really don't know what grade I'm going to give, so I'm just going to sidestep that question. But I think in the long run, there's a very vigorous debate around energy in India now. And there's a lot of very strong, important players, like we've been discussing. And I think, and Modi, as Chief Minister of Gujarat, has shown that. The Chief Minister of the current, now the new state of Andhra Pradesh, is enormously capable and will be doing something great. And the competition with the neighboring state of Telangana will enable that Telangana will also get it done. So I think it's really, India is a federated system, so I think there's going to be 1,000 flowers blooming, and different states are going to take their path, and that competition is good in a way. And I think without regard to whatever the parliamentary politics are, I think Modi's, at least some of these large goals he has set forth, and he's in his own cabinet trying to exercise, I think it's a good thing. The bad thing about any democracy is that it's going to take time. You cannot just run roughshod. I don't know whether you've seen a book. There's a very interesting book that argues for why you find straight roads in some countries and very strange kind of circuitous roads in other countries, and politics explains that, where you can actually have very dirigist governments that can really say, this is how we're going to do this, you're going to get straight roads. But in some other countries like India and others, you're not going to get straight roads. Sometimes you'll find, like in Chennai, smack dab a huge tree in the middle of a road. People are just driving around it. Anyway.
There must be an enormous political inertia in India. I mean, we see Modi come on board and there's all change in the press, but how does it affect the people you deal with there?
Yeah,
did they even notice?
Or the people, our customers, I mean, probably not. Like, I wouldn't say they'd be well in tune with the federal I haven't asked them.
Sure.
I should ask that next time I'm there.
But does it make a difference?
I think they know, like they know locally what's happening. There's definitely, local politicians come round. I think you touched on a really good point there, Gautam, that what it's done, I feel like what Modi's done is set this inspiring vision. Like, he came out in his election and said, I want every household to have a light bulb, a solar-powered light bulb, and a toilet. And we were like, yes! Are you going to give us millions of dollars to make this happen? He hasn't done that. But it certainly put energy poverty, energy access on the map, where I don't think it really had been there before. I don't feel like, I know when we were starting Pollinate, we were fighting this uphill battle of teaching people about why electricity is important. And now it seems to be really common knowledge. So I think he's done a really good thing there. And he's also, I guess, set a course of action so that people like us can come in and drive our solution forward, knowing that there's, consensus at the top level. Whether they're going to give us money or not, I mean, at this stage, I doubt it. If we're in 10 or 20 cities in 2 years' time and we can do it better than them, maybe they will. But yeah, I think more than anything, what it's done has provided unity and vision so that lots of players can come in and argue the case for their initiative.
I wouldn't mind adding a counter to it, which is one of the things he's done is to say that by 2030, I think it is, every state and every person in every state will have 24/7 power. Now, what that really means in the way they define it is that by again, this access to 24/7 power is that the power lines will be to the village and at least 10% of the people will have connected. That's electrified. Well, what about the 90% who can't connect? Yeah, it's not, so what they measure is sometimes a little concerning.
It's a bit difficult, though, isn't it? Because it's almost like saying somebody wants to eat an elephant and you're complaining because he's only going to start with the tail. But you have to start somewhere.
Sure.
So it's an easy criticism, but where do you start?
But be careful when you tick the box for success.
Yeah, don't tick the box too early. Yeah. Gentleman in the middle.
Yes, I was in Delhi about a month ago, and I was representing the Global Change Institute, and I was lucky enough to spend an hour with the director, I can't remember what the exact title was, but he was the guy that was responsible for reforming the power grid in the Ministry for Power. And we spent an hour and he walked me through a whole range of problems across the various states, and obviously there's a lot of variety in the challenges they face. But right at the end he said, but we've got a plan, and he actually said the two challenges is access and reliability. He said everyone by 2019 is going to have access, and reliability will be 24/7 by 2019. And I almost thought he was joking, and I was waiting for him to laugh, but I sort of challenged him on it, and he said, oh, well, maybe it'll slip by a year. But it was funny, like it sort of goes to what you said about sort of ambitious goals. It almost seemed like, there's a risk of setting expectations so high that perhaps some of his political sort of adversaries can sort of try and take shots at him, because it just seems such a ludicrous target. And I did also get the feedback when I was over there that the definitions of all these things, sort of present a picture of progress that might not be reality. So I just was wondering, like, do you actually have a view of the plan? Do they have a published plan, like, that people can scrutinise? Because it seemed like if they did, there must surely be some holes in it.
Who's going to take that one?
I haven't seen anything. Have you?
No, but there are very good published plans for these visions for solar and wind and so on. But part of what you're raising is, what is the roadmap? What does the roadmap look like? And what are the anticipated roadblocks? I don't think there's some critical attention to that is missing.
Yeah, if you live in Delhi today, you are electrified, you have 24/7 access, except that you'll have about 8 hours of power outages a day.
That's very Indian. I was just going to add that, I mean, in the context of this person you were talking to, they probably did have a fair amount of access to electricity. And what we encountered in Bangalore, I think Bangalore was one of India's first electrified cities, or early electrified. So it's a huge sense of pride for Bangaloreans that they have electricity, and that's, like, their heritage. And they outright did not believe us when we